Can you introduce yourself
Okay.
and tell us who you're here to talk about, how you knew them?
Okay. I'm Ken Sher. I'm currently a professor emeritus at the University of Missouri. And I'm here to talk about Alan Marlatt and some of my experiences with him. And I feel terrible because I've been cleaning out an office and going through hundreds and hundreds of files to basically pitch stuff. And I found a reprint that this is a very important story to me in a way.
Yeah.
That back in the old days, you guys want to reprint these down. You don't get reprints from people. You download it from the
Right.
or you have a journal that you're subscribed to, you can do it. But in the old days, you used to write to somebody for a reprint. And this was, I suspect, say 1978. And I was in grad school and asked him if, for this reprint on stress and coping, this annual volume on stress and coping. It was alcohol stress and coping. And he wrote this personal note on it and said, and he was going to be coming back in the end to give a colloquium. And that's where he had graduated. And he said, really looking forward to it. And it meant like huge amount of it. It's this famous star, and here I have a grad student writing, for a reprint. I never have anybody write anything. Well, not never, but rarely. And that was certainly the first time. And it was personal.
Right, and to have it of anyone to get your first note from.
Yeah. So, that made it fun. And actually, he came, I guess, a few weeks later or something to give, and it was fun. I got to hang out with him quite a bit, and he distinguished himself in a couple of ways. And we brought in a lot of very distinguished speakers. And it was a very vibrant, very active colloquium series every Friday. And for, say, the area, Alan was clinical. Typically, you have like a dinner with grad students, and then they go off to the real party with faculty. Alan was the only person who wanted to just stay at the party with grad students.
Why did he want to do that?
Just because he was just having a good time.
Okay.
And it wasn't like, I have to go through, like I remember, and this should be cut, Chef Siegel came. And it was clear, he didn't get the same kind of crowd that Alan did, even though very distinguished scientist,
right?
Very important work at the time. And it was like Dave knew it, maybe another person, and it was like looking at his watch. When do I go to the real party? But for Alan, the thing with the students was the real party.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And some things that actually related to some of the other questions you asked me to think about is kind of training, what could change. Alan did a walk through the building. We hadn't been there in probably 10 years or so. And he walked by the room. He had done his qualifying. They were called qualifying exams, but comps.
Right. Yep.
And back then it was 3 days written work.
Right.
I thought ours was tough, 1 day. And just how training has changed. In terms of what was required, and he still had some kind of trauma-related symptoms because he doesn't remember what it was like to be locked in there. Right? So anyway, that was the first time I met him. And he was important in my life, and that I've only done one sabbatical in my entire life, and it was one at University of Washington. He invited me out. He had just gotten the KO5.
Excellent.
So he was released from his teaching duties. So we got the university to use some deposits to bring in visitors. And actually, there were a lot of great visitors he brought in. I'm trying to think, I think Jaley was one, Saul Shepard was one, but I was the first. So I got to know him, better then. But along the way, I would meet him at meetings. He was always very charming. Once he spaced me completely. He said, okay, I'll meet you, by the cafeteria at 9 or whatever, in the lobby at 9. I was there. And then I saw him, and I just felt broken apart. I saw him later, and he goes, oh, yeah, I spaced it. It wasn't like any apology or anything. And because I also think, and as I got to know him better, he was not into beating himself.
Not into what?
Beating himself.
Oh, okay.
In fact, I remember when RSA was meeting in Maui. So that was in the mid-90s. You could look up the exact year. I was upset about. It might have been a personal relationship, something. And Alan, who's a practicing Buddhist, said, you gotta like stop the double dukkha. I had never heard of the phrase double dukkha.
And what is that?
It's basically, well, dukkha is shit. Shit happens.
Okay.
Shit happens to everybody. Double dukkha is when you pile on the shit on yourself.
Okay.
And so it was kind of very interesting.
Yeah.
How he would bring in his kind of philosophical beliefs, philosophical, spiritual beliefs. And there was actually one interesting anecdote I think says a lot about him, because you'd asked if I, like if there's one question.
Yes.
I don't know what it be. It has nothing to do with psychology. But, we were at some meeting. It might have been like the MIAAA bench meeting. And, we were talking about that. And he was saying, and just, I quoted Woody Allen saying, the thought of death doesn't bother me. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And his standpoint was the exact opposite. He wanted to be as alert and conscious as he can as he passed over.
Wow.
Or crossed over.
That's amazing.
And, I've kind of come to his perspective, maybe as I'm getting closer to crossing over, in my life.
Wow.
But it was so fascinating, that kind of the Alan Marlatt versus, I guess, Buddhist versus Woody Allen. Discrepancy.
Yeah.
So, but I know you wanted to know a little bit, and probably other people have told me the story. Alan used to tell it a lot, how he got involved in, I will say, psychosocial research, but have you heard the story of what happened when he was running subjects in Isidore Gormazano's lab?
No, in fact, Katie didn't. She said if she could ask him, she would ask him about how he got into it.
Well, I can tell you how he got into, not necessarily the alcohol per se, but the things that set up the alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Gormazano is very, he wound up going to Iowa. I don't know, Grant, if you know Isidore Gormazano's work on idling conditioning. But he was, classical conditioning person, very well regarded. And Alan was running subjects for him. And, some aversive stimulus was their participants' island. That's part of it. And the subject screamed.
Oh.
And Alan said he finished up with that and just walked down the hall and walked into Ken Heller, who is a clinical psychologist. And Ken was known at the time for trying to translate basic the social psychological perspectives into clinical psychology. I encourage those two. And but Alan wanted to get away from any kind of aversive stimulation or anything like that. So he started working in Ken Heller's lab, and Ken was doing a lot of social learning and again saying, how can we use this? And so if you look at some of Alan's earliest experiments, it would be fun to have this data in front of us. He did publish some of the work from Sara.
Oh yeah.
Dan Lilly, which he wound up marrying from classmate of mine. So this is these class in the end of the 60s.
Yeah. That's interesting. I sort of know his earliest work in quotes and his sort of alcohol taste test and stuff. This is before that, you're saying?
Oh yeah, this is well before that. He published with Ken on some social, but I think before the stress-induced drinking stuff with the taste test, maybe it was going on simultaneously, but definitely more influenced, I think, by the stuff he did with Ken was effects of drinking partners. And using imitation and modeling.
And that's sort of coming back around in this meeting.
Oh, isn't it? I haven't.
Yeah.
Well, as people get more into context.
Yep, exactly.
And it was nice because, with the thing that Alan did is he took these things that were never really studied well experimentally and studied them experimentally. So you have drinking, Confederates who will drink at different paces, and things, as opposed to trying to infer it from correlational data. And certainly the taste test was useful, and he would do crime sometimes too. I mean, the paper on loss of control is probably, I think, one of the most important papers ever in this business. And had a huge effect when MIAAA did a 25th anniversary issue. That paper was in it. Yeah, so that which for you guys doing this historical thing, it might be useful to, if you haven't
Yes.
already, looked at that alcohol health and research world.
Okay, yeah.
To see
I mean, certainly I signed the loss control paper for my students. You know.
Yeah, and it was controversial, but it was good. Other people followed up and said, well, the extent to which it might be expectancy driven might be the severity of dependence, which wasn't resolved very well in that study. But just this notion that it wasn't necessarily one drink that drunk, because it opened up all these other areas. Because a lapse in terms of its relapse prevention isn't the same as a relapse.
That's right.
And preventing a lapse from becoming a relapse. And to kind of say, no, this gospel has problems and we don't have to accept that canon. And we could go ahead and explore.
Yeah, so his relapse prevention is huge, and it's so foundational now.
Yeah.
But it was controversial at the beginning, right?
Well, particularly the thing that was really, I think, controversial is if you have a sip or if you have a drink, it's not the end of the world.
Right.
That was the part, I think, obviously understanding the conditions, and a lot of people jumped on and started studying relapse situations and what is it about these situations that kind of go relapse.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it was because it meant it was a journey. It wasn't just a descent.
Exactly. Yeah, I was saying to Katie, we start almost every people with alcohol, the chronic relapsing disorder, right? And that was novel, sort of the idea that lapses don't turn into relapse.
No, and and he was somebody who definitely was not averse to substance use, including alcohol.
Right.
And, and I think it's in a way he's kind of an earlier version of the Carl Hart.
Okay.
I think Alan was better in terms of being grounded in psychosocial research and psychology. I think Carl came out of a more of a pharmacologic kind of perspective.
Listen, we need all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And there were other people though too around the same time. Peter Nathan, who got. I don't know. I'm not sure if familiar with it.
No, sir.
But he and Jack Nicholson working at the Boston City Hospital, they would bring in what they would call, chronic alcoholic, skid row alcoholic. Sorry about terminology, but this is kind of how it was referred to. And they would be able to operantly respond for alcohol in the hospital, but they could either choose to do that or have visitors.
Wow.
And the notion was that these guys are always going to choose alcohol. All their the language of some people today, their reinforcement systems have been hijacked by that. And it wasn't true. And actually, I sometimes get a little frustrated when Carl talks about kind of analogous situations, not giving, acknowledging the provenance back to like Nicholson, Mellows, Pioneer.
Okay.
And actually, if you were to ask me, one of the questions to me, one of the things about training is people look at the most recent journals. They don't know the history. It's not like people were backwards then or whatever. I mean, they certainly didn't have a lot of research methodology today. But I'm always struck in terms of looking at the relationship between temperament and drug effects. That William McDougall in the late 1920s was talking about stuff people talk about today. But he's never acknowledged. It might be different now about executive function and alcohol.
But everything that it seems new is actually, it's probably
it's hard to come up with something totally. And a lot of what McDougall said, and he was like wrote the textbook on physiological psychology, social psychology. He had the William James professor at Harvard after he had come from Oxford and then founded the department at Duke. And this was just one of his things, but other people who followed and kind of picked up at the relationship between personality and sedation thresholds for drugs.
Yes.
And and I suspect that'll come back because people will read literature and think, I only have to go back 5 or 10 years.
Right. What they're missing so much.
Yeah. Well, particularly too, because often it was theoretically richer, even though not necessarily methodologically stronger.
Sure. I think that's absolutely,
So anyway, but Alan was very well schooled in a lot of things, but he was also very open. I loved the sabbatical that I took with Alan. We'd go out to lunch every week. I go to his meetings, and actually Dan Kiblahan, who was my first Ph.D. Now I can't really take credit for Dan because he came to me fully formed. You know, he was on internship and needed a dissertation. This is kind of an earlier era, and I was doing alcohol stuff, so you know, I helped him. But he was at the VA, but also worked very closely with Alan. And you know, Alan was not a great experimentalist in a way, even though he did experimental work early in his career. But both John Baer and Dan Kiblahan were the ones who were the methodologists and would develop things for like the early basic stuff. In fact, I was there during the pre-basics stuff, and we'd be interviewing students who had I guess they were like disciplinary referrals, and it was really eye-opening to me. Just remembering what it's like to be an 18, 19-year-old boy, you know, in college. Because, you know, I remember having these interviews with John, particularly John. Alan was there for some of them, saying, I can't imagine going to a dance or something and walking up to a woman unless I was totally touched. And you go, yeah, I can see that, you know, and we forget just how anxiety provoking this is. And whether or not it's the pharmacologic effect of alcohol, it's having a prop in your hand, you know.
Something to do with your hand, sure.
So, but anyway, in terms of asking what is about, they're all the stuff he's done. It's very important. Some of the stuff about housing that he did with Mary Larimer, very important, but I see that more kind of from a community health perspective, social justice. And I don't think you need to know a lot. I mean, certainly his notions about determinants of drinking influence that kind of policy piece. And right now, there's so much pushback about giving people stuff for free. What you want to pay people, like, or even within behavioral treatment. But it's very important work. But I don't know how totally tied in. It was to earlier stuff.
That was more a personal project.
A
passion project, if you will.
Yeah, no, and I think it tied in with his values. So the thing I love about the expectancy stuff, and he would be the first one to say he did not invent the balanced placebo design. I forgot the person who did. I think maybe with analgesics. But he's certainly the one who exploited it. And really, not just with alcohol, not even just with drugs, but I see people. I remember Tom Borkovic, in terms of anxiety reduction, would do that with behavioral treatment. You know, and it's just this idea is we could manipulate the belief about what you're getting.
People currently doing it with Adderall these days.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I don't see much with alcohol at all, and it's hard to pull it off well. You know, particularly if you're going above, you know, 0.8 grams per kilogram or something. You know, slowly, sure. Okay. You know, no, I think if you're down below, half a gram per kilogram or something, you could pull it off, particularly if you have, you know, even without a floater and stuff, you know, because again, all of us, not, you know, most of us, you know, kind of bought into the value of doing that. You know, Dave Newland, I think, was a classmate of mine in the same lab here ahead of me. I think he took some of this stuff, you know, in an interesting, important way, because it also meshed well with some of the work that was coming out. Actually, we talked about Sher and conditioning processes. And so all of a sudden, a placebo became something else rather than substitute for that. It could be something that could elicit a countervailing response. You know, so I think, you know, we think of it, oh, here's expectancy of that, but they aren't necessarily thinking of potent process theory.
They aren't.
You know, and so, you know, I think that just kind of ingenuity in design kind of became translational. And I'm surprised we don't see more of, like, you know, important figures. Shep Siegel's work. You know, it was very popular in the late 70s and 80s. And he also, even like, I've seen papers he's done on it's not just related to drug effects, but visual after images. Things like that, those process stuff. So anyway, I thought that was good. I think he was interested both in alcohol effects, but also stress-induced drinking. And we were very interested in, like, is there a difference between, say, a social stressor and a physical stressor? In fact, the first alcohol study I did in Bob Levinson's lab, and Bob had never done any alcohol before. We actually compared, based on some of those early studies, stress-induced drinking studies, a social stressor that is, was it make a self-disclosing speech about what you like and don't like about your body and physical appearance.
Wow.
And then the other one is you're going to get a shock. And in both cases, there was a countdown. And we found really didn't matter, but we did, but it was motivated by, and then one of the, in terms of not knowing earlier literature, I think one of the, a lot of the controversy now about, the recent meta-analysis of VMA studies is we've known for 50 years that it's so highly conditional about whether or not something's going to when stressed. Like, what's the nature of the stress? You have an exam coming up later that day? Yeah, I'm going to drink. So come on. Or do you have better, in terms of putting it in a larger emotion focus and action oriented coping?
Yes. I mean, someone was talking to me, one of the she was saying when it's unexpected negativity, that needs to coping mechanism, right? As opposed to planned drinking.
Well, that's the other one too, is because people are very versatile drinkers.
Yeah.
Now, in fact, if you look at things like drinking motive questionnaire, some former colleague Cooper developed, but based on other theories. People who drink to cope also drink to get high. Yes. Also drink to get along better in social situations. And those are the big three. The fourth kind of social conformity is for young people. For people, like if you're in high school or something.
Right. Yeah. We can cut this, but my current student, her master's is on that, looking at in our human data, there's 4 and so we're analyzing in terms of, do you ever cope, and is coping your main motivation or something?
Well, it was interesting. We did a study looking at whether or not, what's his name, the Swiss guy who's in Australia. I'm talking about.
No, sir.
But he would do the studies where he would divide people into coping and enhancement drinkers. But he did some kind of. Anyway, we showed it was purely an artifact. Because if you do that with any data, you get 2 groups.
Right.
And I mean, even when there's a unidimensional structure under it. But I think most people are versatile drinkers if they're drinkers.
Yeah.
Maybe if they don't drink, it's for one good reason.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, but it's sunny, I'm going to drink. It's rainy, I'm going to drink. Yeah, of course.
Well, one of the other things, so I've been on a lot of symposiums now. One of the things that struck out from one president, it was, he was a great speaker. In fact, he had a standard thing on feelings. That was just, it was like this journey through a jungle.
Okay.
So he could tell the story.
Yeah.
But one thing that the slide he put up once that I think a lot about, now we're kind of moving into more problem issues and problem recognition, is a survey of, I think it was some fraternity study. And they asked about different problems, at blacking out, passing out, getting into fight, whatever. And so you saw all of these relatively high endorsements for all of them, particularly these fractals. And actually, he convinced me to study frat house at one point because it's a nice factory for heavy drinking.
Just there.
And so, but anyway, so they go through the list. Yes. You have a problem with alcohol. No.
Right.
Even though all these problems have just been primed.
Right.
And so I think the whole issue of problem recognition is a whole separate. We've studied that a little bit, never published anything on it. It's very complicated. Even though some whole literatures are based on problem, sample on problem recognition.
I guess I think
like natural recovery literature. Is, did you ever have a problem without get over it, which presupposes you recognize.
I wonder if people recognize the problems, but The cost benefit analysis, that's a shit.
Maybe, yeah, no, it's true. It's, well, that's the other thing too, is people will drink strategically, like, I haven't seen a reference to self-handicapping, except for maybe something I might, but was an interest that people will get trashed to have an excuse
Right.
to do something. So is it the doing something a consequence? No, the doing something was planned. The alcohol was an instrument.
Very true.
To get there. And the same thing with sex.
Yeah.
In other words, oh God, no, I probably shouldn't have done it. I drank too much. But no, you drank too much because you want to have sex.
Sure. Yeah. Well, maybe this newer generation, because they seem to be. Actually, I have no idea if it's true. I get the impression that they're using substances less for that kind of reason.
Maybe, but they're also supposedly having sex less too.
Shoot! Yeah. Well, COVID ruined everything.
Well, again, who knows what's going on too with social media and all that stuff, so and how much we're looking at a true secular trend versus a blip.
Right. Good point. Let's see. So let's see. Is there anything that you wanted to tell us that we haven't covered? Because you sort of covered all my questions already.
I think, well, yeah, maybe one thing is, and again, you'll have a chance to talk with some extraordinary training records.
Yeah.
If you look at how many people went out, and a lot of them people don't even think about. He had a number of postdocs along, or people he collaborated with. So and he had a personal touch with all of them.
Right.
And again, I only took one sabbatical in my entire career. I'm glad I did it for that.
Yeah.
Because he's just such a warm, and generative, creative person. So there's not a lot of folks who are like that.
Right.
And then are very unselfish with their time. And it's not like, oh, the big guys over there, there. It doesn't matter who you are. One of the things people say, could you be like anybody on TV? To me, it's Anthony Bourdain. Because Anthony Bourdain, he could interact and connect with just about anybody. And that's what I loved about watching.
Yeah.
And Alan
had that same quality.
Yeah, Alan had the same quality.
That's beautiful.
So he did things his way. He took very bold positions, did not get intimidated. I don't like now. A lot of the stuff is that we think about. It's like just is standard knowledge. At the time, it was really challenging orthodoxy.
Absolutely, just the idea that it's a process. The idea of relapse really not being the end of the world and everything.
Well, and I'm trying to think. He also stood by his friends. After the Sobels, they had really kind of got canceled.
Yeah.
Because of the controlled drinking. Right? And he wrote this beautiful piece. I think it was in JSAT.
Okay.
Basically in support of what they've done. Everybody else kind of backed up. Okay, maybe this is a mistake, but
Well, I don't think. Do you mind talking about that a little bit? Because I don't think people know really. People, when we think of Sobel, we think of the time I followed them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, actually, they were working. What was it? It was Camarillo, not Camarillo, a state hospital in Southern California. See if I prepared it.
No, I'm sorry, my bad.
Well, no, but anyway, she was grad student. But basically, they very behavioral approach that people who were considered chronic alcoholics could learn to drink socially or in a controlled way. And then this woman named Mary Pendry in the early 80s, maybe 3 or so, had this paper in Science.
How do you remember all of this?
Well, don't ask what I had for breakfast yesterday.
Okay.
But no, but this was like big news. In fact, anyway, so Science magazine, and she followed all these people up, and a lot of them were dead, and a lot of them were dead from alcohol-related things. And in fact, 60 Minutes did a piece on it. They showed Harry Reasoner standing by the graveyard when one of the patients had died, and but I think it was important. Other people pointed out nobody ever followed up with people who such heavy drinkers that way, and there's no control group. But because of the Pendery article, the Sobels were kind of banished. You know, he had been in Pendery, and they, Linda was very close, and Mark, both of them were very close with that. And so they wound up moving, you know, to Canada and worked at the Addiction Research Foundation. I think Mark might be retired now. Linda's still in Nova, you know, Florida. But Alan stood up for them. You know, despite, you know, science and 60 Minutes.
Yeah. That's great. That's a lot of us care.
Yeah, and I think too is, if you look at what they did, I think it was ingenious. I don't think necessarily, you know, again, we didn't have the control group, and it's very easy to take a group of people who are at high risk for death, follow them up 10 years later, and see where they are. You know, but yeah. So you know, I'm trying to think that we were just talking about other things about Alan. So anyway, his and again, that would be a good thing to look up and see if I said anything wrong. But his and Marlatt on the Sobel, you know, controversy.
Yeah, like I had no idea.
No, but it's and then actually, if you want to look this up, I was actually up visiting the Addiction Research Foundation to give a talk there, and I'm trying to think when that was. It must have been in the early 90s, and somebody who actually wound up working at NIH, I'm not going to say their name.
Okay.
I don't want to be there, but they were a research assistant. They came in and said, "Did you hear the news?" So Mary Pendery, who was their nemesis, had been shot, killed by a patient she was treating and maybe having an affair with in Wyoming at a VA or a state hospital in VA. And so it was like, so I was there when the news came out.
That's juicy.
That Mary Pendery was murdered.
Yeah. Wow.
So
it was a different time.
Well, murder still happens. You know.
You know.
No, and I do remember because I mean I'm more overweight now, but I was overweight then. But I used to play racquetball regularly, and Linda Sobel was very competitive. And so, you know, she took me down to the local place. She plays volleyball, and she whipped my butt the first couple games. And I beat her the third game, and it was like she was furious. You know, how could this guy beat me? You know?
Hey, you know, hidden skills. And so, was is there anything else surprising about Alan like that?
If we had the other side of Alan, then it would be appropriate.
Right.
For this.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well then, if there's nothing else you want to say, we can stop.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
How are we doing for time? We did okay.
I don't know, we have plenty of time. Yeah.
So is there anything else, you know, you would ask me questions.
I know, I just want to talk to you about that. Yeah.
Well, you know, again, I'm not a geneticist, so think about this. But, you know, I think most, with the exception of, say, alcohol metabolizing genes, it's hard to find any big single candidate gene effect. And those that are there are probably very small, you know, like you know, accounting for at most maybe 3%.
That's right?
Yeah, and so when you're doing with that kind of stuff, you need huge samples in order to have, you know, in order for your a true signal,
right,
to outweigh all the false positives that you're doing. Unless you have, but in order to have adequate control, you need to have, you know, huge samples. And in terms of getting mechanisms, I don't know, you know, so you can account for a lot more variants with polygenic risk scores. And again, talk to a genetic, but to me, those are heterogeneous. So if you're really trying to, so this is me as an outsider, how I look at it. If you're trying to get in a mechanism, it might be applying various kinds of mechanisms.
Right.
And it could be that it's just an overdetermined kind of thing. So it doesn't necessarily give you the same kind of target. Right. And, you know, with animals, and I don't even see much, maybe you are great. You know, you don't see, I don't read anyway, transgenic kind of sperm as much
anymore. I mean, they exist. Yeah, I guess that was more just a personal question because I came up when we were trying to link Canada genes to imaging.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this is my career.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if you could show something between Conti and cannabis and certain areas of the brain, that would make you'd win a Nobel Prize.
I don't know about that. But if it was a comp gene that came out that had passed GWAS, probably.
Yeah.
Yes. So anyway, that's the question.
No, and you should talk to unrelated to Alex. Ian is so thoughtful about all of these things. Ian guys,
add to the list.
Yeah, he is just so for that kind of thing. And the other person who's very helpful to think about is one of the smartest people I've ever met is Andrew Heath.
Okay.
And also just retired recently, John Hewitt. John, who's in Colorado.
Yes. And I would love to go back out to Colorado.
Yeah. So, all of those people would have very, I think, useful perspectives on the questions.
Yeah.
But no, I think I think in many ways, and probably people have been shocked by somebody at that age for this. Human Genome Project has kind of been a bust. It's not Genome Project.
I know.
And I think people thought going back, okay, by the time we are now, it's like human disease would be cured.
I would love this.
Oh, were you?
Not that it would be cured,
but we've made and it's not to say some great things haven't come out of it, but if you look at the total investment, the optimism, and whatever, and it's kind of humbling to think that once we have this whole thing decoded, we got it solved. And we were wrong. But it was a good bet, I think. It was just we came up short.
Well, that's why we're doing the transcriptomes now.
Yeah, no, hopefully one thing leads to, okay, so we went down that alleyway.
Yeah.
So now we have to try
something
else. So what were some of the other questions you had? I'll just try and.
Oh, yeah. You don't mind.
No.
Yeah.
What's on to the next one?
I'm not sure about the answer. So I wanted to ask you about maturing out and how I think it might be, based on my understanding, it might be more about the idea of persistence and that maturing out is something we call it, but that real dreams don't mature out. Does that make sense?
Well, it could be, but I don't know if that's true.
Me neither, but
because we've looked at, there was a paper on one of my grad students, I think it might have been Alvaro Freitas, who's at the meeting, because we were thinking a lot, if you look at the age prevalence curve, say AUD or alcohol dependence, we might have been in this paper focusing on some more alcohol dependence. We think, okay, so we have this big peak in early adulthood.
Yeah.
And it goes down.
Yes.
And, so what happens is, how persistent or impersistent are these as a function of the severity of diagnosis?
Right.
And we found just as much, again, it's only 2 ways of data, so we don't know the whole life course or whatever, but I thought it was going to be all the people who were maturing, so-called maturing out, were the people who were barely through the threshold.
No, but it was super high.
It was both. It was, they would come
both
down.
ends, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
The entire, continuum. So mild, moderate, severe.
Yeah.
So there was something going on about that stage of life. And again, with the changing drinking demographics, so that thing might be pushed out a little bit. So on one hand, you might be right, because these things, like if you look at diabetes, if you were to say, what do we really need to do? What is real need to do? Our diagnostic technology sucks. That's something that's taken, I thought when I started out in the 80s that there were things, the UCA study had come out, there was the DIS, all of a sudden I could have real data from interviews and make global diagnoses. It was going to be great. And I did it, and everybody was promoting. And then when we started seeing how bad, just over a 1-year period, lifetime diagnosis was, the amount of people rescinding the diagnosis, and then all the stuff about how people misinterpret what these are, that all this stuff that Ashley Watts, who's a recent postdoc of mine, is that all this, like if you look at the DSM-5 task force, whatever, the unidimensional structure was only because they're using these 11 criteria.
Right.
And it's the only thing that can fit because because I'd be able to identify higher order structures.
Mhm.
And so I would say, what is one of the worst things going on there is we take data that exists because they exist, and then we either put them in a symptom network model or factor analyze it in some way. And, in both, and it's like, wait a second, what do we think the structure of alcohol use disorder should be? Then let's have multiple items assessing each part of that, so that we could actually resolve the structure. And so actually Cassie Bonas, another recent grad student, has shown this too.
Yeah.
And Ken Kendler showed this over 10 years ago with if you use genetically informed data,
Right.
with twins. So one is we got to go back a little bit, at least the people working with humans, and say how could we assess what we're interested in better. That's because it's foundational to everything else. So I've tried to, that's my most recent interest in, but I was just amazed at how gullible I was, that I thought we had this great technology.
Yeah.
And it was better than the questionnaire problem inventory and math.
Sure. Yeah.
To have a real diagnosis without realizing how flaky they were. Sean Lane, who's here, a former postdoc of mine, he did a meta-analysis across every study. It was like 30 of DSM, and looked at the interclass correlation of the thresholds, for my response.
Right.
The ICC was in the 0.2s. So one interview, like Saga has a very high threshold for withdrawal. That is pretty middling. If you use a CD of, and actually Saga for craving, I had desire so strong I couldn't think of anything. This is not that study, but other stuff we've done versus what's in the DSM. And Odatis has that, but also a lower one that was in 10 minutes. The burden is strong desire urge. That's like a 10-fold difference, 5 to 10-fold depending upon the sample. So which is craving.
Yeah.
And that's one of the fact that we're doing all these dichotomies, because clearly,
Oh, yeah.
We're just talking.
he knows that. Everybody knows that. Now, Ed is another story. Nobody knows that.